Hi, everyone, and welcome to this co-production of WION and Voice of America. I'm Susan Tehrani, coming to you live from New York City. We begin today with the top story from the Middle East, the Israel-Hamas war. U.S. National Security Advisor Jake Sullivan is on a two-day visit to Israel. This comes at a time when it's being reported that a rift between American and Israeli leaders is widening due to the rising death toll in Gaza. The Biden administration's support for Israel in the war against Hamas has drawn sharp criticism from members within his own party, including from some at the State Department, calling for a ceasefire. Meanwhile, President Biden has been signaling to Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu that he needs to change course or risk international isolation. VOA's senior diplomatic correspondent Cindy Sain reports.
For decades, the United States has sought to mediate the conflict between Israelis and Palestinians over land, control of religious sites, and sovereignty. In 1993, a promising moment at the White House, when Israeli Prime Minister Yitzhak Rabin and Palestine Liberation Organization negotiator Mahmoud Abbas signed a declaration on self-government, commonly referred to as the Oslo Accords. Peace appeared close at hand, but the Palestinians ended up violating the agreement, according to former U.S. Assistant Secretary of Defense Lawrence Korb, who witnessed the signing. Korb, now a senior fellow with the Center for American Progress, tells VOA he still believes in a two-state solution, but under a new Palestinian leadership.
Now, the Palestinians got to get their act together. You know, their leader, Mahmoud Abbas, he's out of it. He's too old. He can't, be effective. They have to get another leader, too. And if you can get a separate Palestinian state out of this horrible situation, that will be really a significant achievement and will make it much easier to maintain stability in the region.
Aaron David Miller worked for Republican and Democratic administrations for decades, often as part of the U.S. team trying to negotiate peace in the Middle East. He sees more continuity than change in U.S.-Israeli relations, especially with President Joe Biden in the White House.
For Joe Biden, alone among modern American presidents, he considers himself literally part of the Israeli story. His relationship with Israeli prime ministers and other leaders goes back decades. I mean, he insisted on going into a war zone when this crisis first broke.
Biden embraced Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu just days after members of the U.S. designated terrorist group Hamas killed 1,200 Israelis and took more than 200 others hostage in the brutal October 7th attack. He has repeatedly said the United States will always be there for Israel. But in 2 months, Israel has pounded the Hamas-run Gaza Strip, displacing at least 2 million Palestinians, wounding more than 50,000 people, and killing thousands more in the bloodiest campaign in the decades-long conflict. Biden recently told an audience of political donors that Israel is losing support from other countries because of its indiscriminate bombing of Gaza, and that Netanyahu should change his hardline government. In New York and other cities, thousands of Americans have taken to the streets to protest the killing of Palestinian civilians in Israel's offensive against Hamas. Some White House and State Department staff also have strong feelings about the conflict, with some signing letters of protest and even resigning from the administration.
People on the inside of the State Department have been watching our policy towards Israel, for many years, for decades in some case. And we've largely had unconditional military support for Israel. So there's an understanding on the inside that we have not used tools that we have available, using the leverage that we have with our military support to press Israel to do more to address the Palestinian issue.
And while many have demonstrated against Israel's offensive, thousands of Americans also turned out in Washington in mid-November to support Israel and condemn anti-Semitism. Cindy Sain, VOA News, the State Department.
For more on this, we have with us VOA's Jessica Stone live from the White House with additional details. Good morning, Jessica. Jake Sullivan is spending 2 days meeting with top Israeli officials. What does he hope to achieve, and what have we learned so far about his trip and talks with Israeli officials?
Yeah, he has had these 2-day meetings, beginning with meetings with the War Cabinet of Israel, talking to them about the need for the high-intensity portion of this campaign in Gaza to end, he says, according to Axios, in a matter of, quote, weeks, not months. The concern also expressed by Jake Sullivan in the region, the national security advisor from the White House, is also about the displacement of these Palestinians. You heard Cindy Sain talk about 2 million displaced. Jake Sullivan has been in the region engaging with Saudi Arabia and others, talking about trying to keep this conflict from spreading, including addressing the humanitarian crisis in Gaza. Now, Washington, of course, does have some leverage in this situation. It provides billions of dollars in military aid, and part of the conversation going on Capitol Hill is how to use that military aid to Israel to influence what happens on the battlefield. And politically speaking, Biden does have some vulnerabilities here. He, of course, is up for re-election in 2024, and his progressives and young voters, according to polling, indicate that they are more critical of his stance on Israel. And so he does have a political calculation here to make as well. Susan?
Yeah, and this week the United Nations General Assembly voted overwhelmingly for a ceasefire in Gaza after a UN Security Council resolution last week failed because the U.S. vetoed it. It's important to note that GA resolutions are non-binding. They're not like the ones at the Security Council. But does this impact Washington's standing at the UN at all?
So observers that we've talked to here at Voice of America indicate that, yes, there is some impact on other things that the United States is trying to accomplish through the UN body. As you mentioned, at the UN this week, 153 of 193 countries voted to support a permanent ceasefire in Gaza. And Washington has taken the position, as we've talked about before, that it does not support a permanent ceasefire, and that would just help Hamas regroup, and that there should be no end to the fighting until Hamas releases all of the hostages. After that vote, though, in the General Assembly this week, Russia's ambassador to the United Nations said this. He said the U.S. now bears responsibility for every civilian killed in Gaza. And observers say that Washington's support for Israel, as the number of civilian casualties grows, could cost it, particularly with nations in the global south who have ties to Russia, because, of course, the other major objective at the United Nations for Washington right now is to increase support for Ukraine and to increase condemnation of Russia's actions in Ukraine. Those two things, say observers, could be in conflict at the United Nations. Susan?